It is very hard to get started as a designer, and that's mostly due to the fact that there's just so many things that you have to do right in order to craft an interface that's very easy to use. So sometimes it's a little bit easier to just focus on what not to do. Give yourself a set of rules, and then from there usually a sensible interface kind of emerges on its own. So today we're going to be focusing on the 5 biggest mistakes that most new designers make when they're first getting started. And my hope is that at the end of this video, you'll be the ultimate design Chad who won't be making any of these mistakes and will be able to crank out useful interfaces for humans quite quickly. So without any more delay, here's rule number 1. Typography makes or breaks a UI. It literally affects almost every component on your page. Everything that a user interacts with usually has some sort of text or a title or a label. So if you get typography wrong, your entire interface just feels clunky and amateurish. Here's an example of a marketing site I recently designed, and I've swapped out the font to use just Arial. And you can see this has a profoundly negative impact on the UI. Everything kind of just feels a little weird. But if we swap in the nice clean DM Sans font, you'll find the design just kind of comes together and feels much more cohesive. But it's not just marketing sites that have this problem. If you have a product UI that's using some kind of system font, it's just gonna look a little weird. If instead we introduce a nice modern font, the whole thing feels a lot more professional. And there's a couple of reasons for this. The first is that certain fonts, particularly the base system font, like Arial, Times New Roman, Courier, things like that, have kind of just been accepted as these are like the boilerplate fonts that no one really uses. You just get the sense that something's not right. Another reason is that fonts themselves introduce a lot of brand feel to an interface. So if you have a very sleek serif font, it's going to feel a lot more elegant and premium than, say, a standard clean and simple sans font. So being intentional about your typography is usually a brand decision, and not being intentional usually means you don't really understand the brand dynamic that well. And finally, the really good performant typefaces out there have very many font weights. They're usually what's known as variable fonts, and they allow you to add medium weight, semi-bold, bold, thin, black, different types of font weights that can very specifically pull user attention to very specific parts of your UI. You don't necessarily want to use a bold font every time you want to pull someone's attention. Maybe you want a medium font because something needs to stick out, but you don't want it to just yank their attention. And if you're just starting out, you really don't need anything other than Google Fonts. And I've got a list in the description of some of the best Google fonts that are extremely flexible that you should just use in your next project. I don't really deviate from these fonts very often unless a client has a very specific brand feel they're going for. But let's say you get the typography right. This next mistake usually goes hand in hand with it and makes the typography situation almost completely irrelevant. That's right, color, just like typography, touches almost every part of your UI. But you don't actually need any color to create a sensible human interface. And in fact, if your interface doesn't work without the color, it's usually a sign that your interface has some kind of usability or information hierarchy flaw that you need to address first. In fact, here's this same example as before, but now I'm going to desaturate it and remove all of the color. And you can see that the interface still makes sense. My attention flows through the page in an organic way exactly how I want it to. You read this header first, you see the image on the right, you get a rough idea of what's to be expected on this landing page. You don't necessarily need the color, but it certainly helps to give that extra little bit of flair and visual interest that's often needed to get people to keep scrolling. But notice from this UI that I'm not actually using very much color. It's just lightly splashed onto the page. And the vast majority of the UI is just white. And there is a rule for color theory that I think comes from interior design called the 60-30-10 rule, where you want your interface to be 60% of some primary base color, 30% of some secondary color, and then 10% of an accent color that's really saturated. This doesn't necessarily mean you need to use white as your primary color. You can always use the accent color as the primary color and have the other colors act as an accent. Or if you're going with a dark theme, you can use a darker hue of an accent color as the base, and then add the accent color as, again, the accent color itself. But the 60-30-10 rule reveals that the reason color is useful in design is because it often causes you to introduce some contrast into the UI. So if you have a white background and a black button right in the middle, your eyes are gonna go right to that black button in the middle because of the contrast. And that difference is what pulls people's eyes towards it. Here we can see an example of the 60-30-10 rule in principle, where we have an existing UI that really overuses color. You've got images with color, you've got bright saturated greens, but then you take it and you refactor it and you focus more on a primary background color with some accent colors throughout, and this interface is much easier to consume and doesn't overuse color to the degree that the previous one did. So I hear you saying, okay, the real problem is contrast between a non-saturated color and a saturated color, but why is that a problem? And to understand that, we need to jump to the next issue on the list. Yes, the unintentional visual hierarchy. Overuse of color is just one of the ways that you can craft a visual hierarchy in a way that you don't intend to in the first place. But what the hell is a visual hierarchy? It's essentially the order in which people will look at certain elements in a given context. So I'm gonna show you an image real quick, and I'm gonna disappear for a couple of seconds. I will come back, but just look at this image and notice what happens. You just experienced the visual hierarchy for yourself. Feels good, right? Every single piece of designed media has a visual hierarchy, whether you intentionally created it or not. And the problem is, if you don't intentionally create it, the visual hierarchy is still there, it's just pulling attention to the wrong parts of the UI. And generally speaking, there are 4 mechanisms of controlling visual attention in a UI. The first is very large text that almost always pulls your attention first. The second is any kind of animation or movement that usually yanks your attention to focus on it no matter what. The third is color contrast, the thing we just talked about. And the last is heavy font weights. They almost always pop out and grab your attention. Going back to a reference UI here, you'll now notice that this is crafted very intentionally so that I can understand the value proposition of this freelancer website. First, my attention goes to the big, bold header. This is the first thing that I read. Then I look at the illustration and I'm kind of loosely aware of the call to actions on the page. This illustration is again specifically crafted to help me understand what it might be like to use a platform like this. From there, my eyes move to the text itself, which I will probably not read, but the whole thing together in concert crafts a hero section that's surprisingly effective. But what does effective really mean in the context of design? That's right, the fourth mistake on this list is not having any kind of goal in mind. Oftentimes when talking about design, people will say art is subjective, but designing a software interface or a marketing website is not art. There's usually some kind of motivation driving the interface. Either you want users to be able to complete a task very easily, or you want them to move through some kind of sales funnel if it's a marketing site. So whenever I sit down to start a new interface project, I have to do 2 things in order to create a sensible UI. First, I just have to list out all of the things that I want a user to be able to do in this interface. And then I'll rank them by how important they are. So for instance, if I'm on YouTube, the most important thing is finding and watching new interesting videos. Secondary to that is editing your account details. So I want to walk through an example of how I created user stories for this UI here, which is a redesign of the WordPress dashboard for those of you that might not be familiar. So first I have to list out all of the things that I know a user will want to do in this interface. First, of course, is just navigating the back end of my website, which includes understanding which links are plugins, custom post types, or standard links. I want to view any relevant notifications that the system's trying to make me aware of. I need to be able to customize the pages on my site to my liking. And in order to do that, I need to understand which block is currently selected. I need to be able to edit properties for that block, edit the page settings for that page as a whole, and then of course preview all of my changes on desktop and mobile. So now that we have a ranked list of user stories, we can kind of now look at how each of these problems were solved in the resulting UI that I came up with. First of all, since navigation is extremely important for a WordPress website, it's off to the left, but it's a contrasting black color. That pulls a lot of visual attention. And then of course the notification in the middle use a little bit of contrast and a little bit of color to pull my attention. They're also placed quite close to the screen, which makes me more likely to look at it. And then in order to customize pages on the website, I need to know which section is selected. So again, we will use color and some kind of visual animation to indicate that a particular section has been selected and is now ready for editing. And then for editing properties, on the right, we'll simply have a little block of elements that pretty clearly communicate, hey, the thing you've just selected is now editable here on the right. And of course, I also have to preview my page on mobile. So we've got this little selector up here that uses a shadow to pull a little more visual attention, but not too much because it's at the very end of the list here. It's important to note that this isn't just for software design though. If you're designing a poster or a marketing website, usually the goal is to get people to go to your concert or sign up for your service. That's a pretty simple goal, so you just break it down into secondary design stories. In order to get someone to buy your product, you first need them to trust you, you need to see social proof, you need to understand what the product delivers for them. There's lots of secondary stories that once solved will solve the parent story and get people to move through the funnel. But sometimes you do this exercise and you break down a design problem into lots of little design stories and it's still really overwhelming and you just don't know where to start. And that's where the last issue on the list comes into play. Don't reinvent the wheel. As a designer, I deeply believe that you're obligated to refrain from reinventing the wheel whenever you can. There's this concept in design called affordance, which kind of describes the fact that your users already have in their minds some sort of guidelines that they should follow to solve certain problems in interfaces. Things like the account menu is usually on the upper right, or I should be able to exit this modal by pressing the escape key. People already know about this, so if you also apply those heuristics to your designs, people will start calling your interface intuitive or easy to use because you're working with the user as opposed to against them. But let's face it, when you're a new designer, there's this really strong urge to kind of prove yourself and show that you can design something totally novel, but that's almost always a pretty big mistake. I'm here to tell you that just no one cares how fancy your design is. If you run into a design problem that you think hasn't been solved already in 2024, you're wrong. Someone out there has done this already. You should really just follow along with how they solve the problem and maybe add a little bit of flair yourself. I'm talking about going to sites like Dribbble and Behance to really search for specific examples of how other designers have solved these same design problems, or just going to somewhere like saaslandingpage.com to get inspiration on how to craft a compelling landing page for a very specific service offering. Just copy other designers. That's what they're doing as well. But to really understand this principle, it's easy to think about the interface of the world around you. Things like a door handle is an interface between a human and exiting a room. Or a steering wheel in a car is an interface for maneuvering the vehicle. If suddenly some uppity designer decided to just completely change how door handles worked, there would be chaos. People would be trapped in buildings and there'd be lawsuits everywhere because they just couldn't escape in a timely manner. It's just not worth deviating from these very well-established affordance patterns for the sake of kind of trying to be novel and unique. If you're interested in this concept of how physical interfaces can be translated to software design, check out the book, The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman. The link's in the description. And that's it. You should now be a perfect designer who's never gonna make another mistake again. And if you want to see a more tangible example of how all these principles work in practice, you should probably watch my Visual Studio Code redesign, which the YouTube algorithm seems to love for some reason. See ya.